I've always been particularly jumpy while camping. The idea of running across any kind of animal freaked me the hell out. Along with the countless horror movies I've seen about kids getting murdered in the woods, I've been less than fond of it. Even with all of my reservations towards camping, when my brother asked me to go on a trip with his friends to celebrate graduating, I couldn't bring myself to say no to him. How I wish I would have. Everything started fine. I had packed everything the night before, hoping to actually get some sleep before going into the hot, humid, and frightening mountains. When I had woken up at the crack of dawn, I considered calling him to cancel. Maybe I could say I was sick or that my boyfriend had an emergency, but when he called to ask if I was ready, the excitement in his voice was too much for me to say no to. So I got dressed and groggily got into the car of a bunch of rowdy college students who hadn't had a break since finals week. I didn't know his friends well, having only met a few of them at his housewarming party at the beginning of the semester. I'm quickly introduced to Kayla, an eccentric sorority girl whose peppiness makes my head hurt. Beck, a quieter guy who I learn is Kayla's boyfriend. Lacey, William, and Aria I had already met, all being very nice computer science majors who mostly keep to themselves, though I've been told they party hard when the frat parties get going. "This is going to be so fun," my brother Austin chimes from the front seat. He was always the optimist. He must have seen the sullen look on my face because he quickly reassured all of us that he had been camping for many years and knew this trail like the back of his hand. I was not comforted. When we finally made it up the mountain, the sun had barely begun to come up, illuminating the mountain peaks I learned we'd be climbing. We started on the trail in the morning and finally made it to our first viewpoint after an excruciating amount of hiking. We stopped for a water break and for Aria to take pictures of a flower field that was smothered in butterflies. Austin and I sat staring out over the cliffside, Austin pointing out the general area that we'll be camping. "We'll be crossing Dead Man's Bridge right before the camp spot," he says, pointing out a dot on the map. "Dead Man's Bridge?" I ask uneasy. It's a rope bridge made back in the 1950s to make logging more accessible. Now it's become a pretty famous trail marker. He says with the stupidest smile on his face. "Of course it's a rope bridge. We definitely need more horror cliches on this trip," I say sarcastically. "You know, Sam, maybe you should learn to be more adventurous. Not everything is trying to kill you," he said before standing up to call everyone back to the trail. That comment made me upset. He knew about my anxiety. He knew how much I didn't like doing things that made me upset, but he didn't care. My brother was a lot of things, inconsiderate and annoyingly optimistic, but he was also kind and always knew how to cheer up a room. Makes me sad to think about. We kept on the trail and I decided to stay at the front of the trail, figuring that if someone was going to get snatched by a monster, it would be the person at the back of the pack. Aria and Lacey started talking about how if this was our horror movie, who would die first and the stereotypes each person fell into. It freaked me out when they started talking about what kind of monsters would attack us. I swore I saw something run past us on the trail, but Austin told me it was nothing. It was evening when we made it to Dead Man's Bridge. It was as old and rickety as I thought it would be. There were floorboards missing and the bridge was encased in a rusting metal wire. The water underneath us had to be unsafe for even the most skilled whitewater rafters. I decided to let everyone go first, the coward in me stronger than the kindness. I watched Aria and Lacey go first, yelping and giggling in fear as they walked slowly across the bridge. Kayla and Beck went next. Halfway through, Kayla started intentionally swaying the bridge back and forth, while Lacey and Aria laughed about how Kayla would definitely die first in a horror movie. William and Austin asked me to go first, but I refused. They hurriedly ran across the bridge, mumbling about how the bugs were eating them alive. Then it was my turn. I swallowed my fear and I stepped onto the first wood plank laid on the bridge. The bridge swayed aggressively underneath me as I tried my best to keep my balance. I felt extremely nauseous as I slowly made my way across step by step. Then I heard it. It was a low rumbling sound that slowly turned into a high-pitched scream. It sounded like a person, but it was wrong. I frantically looked all around me and then to Austin. "Did you hear that?" I asked in terror. "Hear what?" he asked skeptically. "That scream." Austin scoffed at me. "Don't be dramatic, just hurry up," he said coldly as he turned around to exit the bridge. I panicked as I heard a rustling sound come from the woods behind me. I rushed across the woods step by step until I was abruptly snagged by a loose piece of wood, my foot stuck between two boards. I could feel the tears start to well in my eyes as I struggled to get free, the rustling behind me getting louder. Eventually, after a few more moments of struggling, I managed to get free and fall towards the exit of the bridge, panting as I walked down the steep steps to the ground. I could feel my heart beating in my chest, looking around at the group of people staring with concern. "Hey, you okay, girl?" Kayla asked. I couldn't tell if she was being condescending. I steadied myself on the rail and looked back across the river, trying to see what was screaming. Austin walked towards me and grabbed my arm, taking me away from the group. "What is your problem? If I knew you were going to make a scene, I wouldn't have invited you," he said angrily. "I swear I heard something, Austin. I'm not kidding," I said, desperate for him to believe me. "Bullshit, Sam. I just wanted to have a good weekend. Either stop being dramatic or make your own way home," he said, yanking his arm away from mine and huffing as he walked back towards the group, putting a smile back on his face. I always hated when he grabbed me. I hated when he treated me like I was crazy. But it had been like this since we were kids. Him being older, he always thought I was an idiot and just making things up for attention. I felt bad for ruining his day, so I shut my mouth and kept hiking, continuously looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to jump out and grab me. We made it to the campsite after a little while, everyone unpacking their tents and setting up their own areas. I decided to set up my tent on the outskirts of everyone else, worried my presence would make everyone upset. I sat on a log next to my tent, waiting for my mini stove to heat up my food. The others huddled around the fireplace, laughing and overall just being loud. I was in misery, constantly checking my surroundings, waiting for something, anything that would prove I wasn't crazy. After a while, I started to believe I actually was crazy. Maybe I was being dramatic. After I ate my food and started to settle down for the night, Kayla walked over to me to ask if I wanted to walk with her to go to the bathroom, buddy system and all. I wanted to decline, wanted to tell her to fuck off and leave me alone, but I didn't. I went with her. We walked out of the campsite with our flashlights on high, looking for the best spot to use the bathroom in these creepy-ass woods. Eventually, Kayla spotted something. She said it looked like a house. I paused, waiting for her to laugh or something to indicate she was joking, but nothing came. She was silent. "What do you mean, a house?" I asked as I turned towards her. She stood frozen with her flashlight beaming onto what looked like an old logger's cabin. "Is it normal to have a cabin this far back?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Probably. Austin said there used to be loggers back in the 50s, I said, unconvinced. She continued to stare forward before slowly stepping towards it. "What are you doing? We definitely shouldn't go in there," I said in a hushed voice. afraid something would hear us and attack. You're too worried, Sammy. Like you said, there were loggers. Maybe there's something cool in there, she replied, but something in her voice was unsure. She was unable to mask her fear. She walked towards the house, only looking back at me to ask if I was coming or not. I eventually resigned to the fact that it'd be more dangerous to be left alone outside. I looked back towards the campsite, but it appeared we had walked farther than I initially thought, as the campsite was nowhere in sight. I followed Kayla inside. Our flashlights illuminated the walls of the old building, the floor creaking loudly as we stepped inside. The building wasn't large, but big enough for what I assume was living quarters for whatever workers were up here. I walked towards the side of the room, looking at an old bed frame that looked to be way too big for a normal person. I didn't have time to think about it before I heard Kayla gasp in fear from behind me. "What's wrong?" I asked as I whipped around to look at her. She was staring in shock at the back wall. It took me a minute to realize what it was. Perched on the back wall was what appeared to be taxidermy. A person's body. Their skin was stitched from what looked like multiple different areas. The eyes were missing, the face grotesquely deformed into a twisted sneer. It was perched on a board that would be used for moose or deer heads. It took all I could not to vomit. I stumbled backwards onto my back, a scream caught in my throat. My flashlight left my hand and rolled away. Kayla was in the corner of the room and was either crying or throwing up, I couldn't tell. I eventually stole myself and crawled to Kayla, whispering about how we needed to leave, but it was too late. The door behind us slammed shut, leaving the only light in the room being the flashlights laying on the floor. All of my fears were coming true. The creature stood tall in a big shadowy outline. I couldn't make out any of its features. It stared at us, unmoving. Kayla was shaking and I was holding her shoulders, grasping onto her as if she was the only thing that could keep me alive. It opened its mouth and a booming, deep voice told us, "This is a sacred space. You are trespassing," it said. I shook and felt tears moving down my face. "We didn't know," I managed to make out between sobs. It slowly started moving towards us and Kayla screamed, flailing backwards, telling it not to come any closer. I couldn't move. Trapped in fear, I watched as this monster stepped towards us, reaching down and grabbing Kayla by her shirt collar, lifting her into the air as if she weighed nothing. She screamed and desperately tried to get away from its grasp. With little effort, it grabbed her by her throat and slammed her against the wall. I heard cracking and Kayla stopped moving, her legs dangling below her. I choked, the tears now pouring out of my eyes. It turned to me. Its face was smooth. Its mouth was stretched wide across its face. It had no other features, no eyes, no nose, just its mouth. "This one's pretty," it said. "I think I'll hang her with the others," they said. Their voice was inhuman, crackling like static on a TV. It moved across the room in a jerky, violent movement. Its bones seemed to snap with each step. I watched it lay Kayla's body on a table, wondering if it forgot about me, wondering how fast I could run to camp, and if it would even help. I managed to lift myself off the ground, and before I could think, I was running through the door and out into the cold night air. I heard the scream. Once again, it started low and rumbly like the waterfall, into a high-pitched screech like a bird. I kept running, unable to even see my hand in front of my face. It was pitch black, like the sky had encased me in it itself. I cried. I pleaded to find someone, for something to help me. Then I saw it. The fireplace glinted through the trees, and I felt relief washed over me. I screamed for Austin, wanting desperately to see his face. I broke through the tree line into the campsite. I froze, my feet halting before the rest of my body, and I buckled to my knees. Blood. There was so much blood everywhere, covering the tents and the trees, the firelight reflecting off of it. I choked as I saw them laying there, motionless on the ground. I crawled over to the only breathing body, Austin. I grabbed onto his face and pleaded for him to be okay. His throat was torn open and he was gurgling on blood. He looked as if he was attacked by a bear, open wounds covering him head to toe. I sobbed and tried holding pressure onto his throat, praying the bleeding would stop. I stared down at my blood-covered hands. Before I could realize, Austin was being dragged away by his leg. Something had a hold of him and was slowly taking him into the darkness of the woods. I couldn't see what it had. I didn't think I wanted to. I held on to him, screaming obscenities at the creatures. I grabbed his wrist and pulled back with all of my strength, refusing to let this demon take my brother. Then I heard the crack of his spine, the sound of his body being torn apart from the middle. I let go of his wrist, and for the first time I screamed. I screamed as I watched the lower half of my brother be dragged into the darkness of the woods. I heard crunching. Was it eating him? I don't know. I don't want to know. I saw a flashlight sticking out of what had to be William's hand. I don't know. Their body was so mangled it could have been any one of them. I sprinted to the flashlight, the blood on my hands making the handle try to slip out of my grasp. I started running as fast as I knew possible, only vaguely knowing where I was going and just trying to stick to the path. The light of the flashlight created shadows that looked like they were going to eat me. I kept running until it became physically impossible. I stopped to try and breathe and process what happened. I knew it was still there, but hoped it would be occupied with the bodies of my friends. They were all dead. There was no doubt in my mind. Part of me didn't want to survive, to get out of the woods, wanting to join my brother in whatever the afterlife is, but I kept pushing. I kept running until I made it to the bridge. I stopped, fear once again consuming me. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the bridge. Then I heard the scream. I turned around and shined my flashlight into the woods behind me. I didn't see anything at first, then it came into view. It was tall, its skin was smooth and white, its face is just as terrifyingly blank as I remember it. Its limbs were too long for its body. It stared at me and stood like a deer in headlights, frozen in my flashlight beam. That's when I realized if this creature wanted me dead, I'd be dead. It killed everyone at camp with no effort. It was playing with me. It was trying to see how long I'd run, how hard I'd try before it caught me. In a last moment of stubbornness, I turned around and continued on the bridge. I heard its footsteps stomp behind me. It landed on the wood planks and made the bridge sway aggressively back and forth. I lost my balance and tried to quickly recover. I felt its hand reach for me. I thought it had me, but it yanked back, trapped in the wood I got stuck in my first time crossing the river. I took advantage of its momentary slowness and sprinted ahead. I don't know how long I ran. I don't think I stopped the whole way down the mountain. At some point, I heard the creature stop following me and turn back towards the campsite. But I didn't stop. I didn't stop moving until I made it to the parking lot, silently thanking Austin for always making me have his car's spare key. I got in and drove, speeding through the stop signs and red lights until I got to the police station. It's all a blur what happened next. The police officers listened to my rapid screaming and stuttering stories and promised to send a search party in the morning. I'm currently sitting in the waiting room trying to scrape the dried blood off my hands. I'm writing this in case something happens to me. A man just walked in. He smiled at me. His smile was too wide. Thank you for watching.